Okay, guys. So I graded your tests over the weekend as well as your observations. A couple people I still have to grade yet. I just picked up over at the Learning Center, so I have to grade those ones yet. But for the most part, I have your tests graded, and I posted them up on Blackboard, so you can see how you're moving through the course as a result of that. I'm going to hand these back. You can keep these. We are not going to be tested on this anymore, so, but please don't just like say, okay, I'm done, I never have to remember this stuff again in my life. It will come in handy knowing this as we go along. So, and I can answer any questions after class is over if anybody wants to take me on the grade that I gave you. So the good news for those of you who, Courtney. Those of you who are crying the blues over how you did on this, one, we're throwing away the worst grade before the semester is over, so whichever, if you could pass that back to Peter, thank you. Here's yours.
It's like in golf, you get a mulligan once in a while.
Exactly. That's exactly how we regard it. It's a mulligan. So whatever the worst one is, we're going to throw that away. And there will also be opportunities to do extra credit. I already put those in the syllabus, so if you didn't see them, they're also up on Blackboard. So if you want to get started with those, feel free to do so. Mark? Yeah. Thanks. Sorry. So we're going to start a new section on, as we move forward. As always, we're following along with the direction that history is going, so we're not skipping around. So we just finished up, we concluded at the turn of the century. And if you're following along in your home edition, we are right here on our map. Remember this timeline that we did at the beginning of the semester, and again, this is also available through Blackboard if you're trying to follow along. We're covering something called the isms. So how many of you guys have had art history classes?
Eons ago.
Art history. Okay, so this is going to be a refresher for you. What we're going to cover over the next week or so is really a refresher on art history. But we have to cover it because art history has a very big relevance to the world of design. We're going to see that a lot of the things that were happening in art, modern art at this period, cross into the graphic arts at the same time. And so there's a direct correlation between what's happening there and in design itself. And so that's why we're going to cover this. There's just as a point of note, as many pictures as there were on this last test, it will be the same again. So please take strong notes about the people and certainly reference your textbook for the images regarding those people. And I would recommend, if you were having difficulty with it, that you start studying these guys early into the game. As they, as I call them off in class, as we go through them, chances are likely that they're going to be on the test. So just plan for that. The other thing is, this Wednesday is the last day for this class before spring break, so all of next week will be spring break, so no school, yay. And also,
not bad.
Also kind of a yay, that we're supposed to be back on the 18th and actually Tri-C will be back on the 18th. However, I have a commitment on that day, so I will not be here. So you're welcome to come to class, but I won't be here on that day. So obviously there will be no lecture given on the 18th. And then sadly, on the following week, on the 25th, I also have a commitment that I can't be here for. So it looks like we're going to probably push back our test into an online version. So if you like the online version of the tests, better than how you did fared on this round, then the next test is I'm almost certain that the next test is going to be an online version. So that might help for some of you guys. And I did note that a lot of you guys did better on the online version than the sit down and they have the stress of being in a classroom kind of test. So hopefully that will help make up some of the points also. So that said, are there any questions on what's coming up ahead or anything at this point? All right, I'm going to jump into the lecture. We have obviously we have no question of the day today because we have nothing to reference it to. So we're going to begin here. Kelly, would you mind hitting the lights for us, please? Good. So we talk about this thing called the isms. And ism is actually a prefix, or I'm sorry, a suffix at the end of a word, ism. And typically when we have ism at the end of the word, it turns the word into a stronger adjective, or turns it into, it actually, no, it turns it into a noun in some ways. So when we think about, can we think of any words that have the letters ism at the back of it?
Capitalism?
Capitalism, good one. Anybody else? Yes.
Professionalism.
Professionalism, good. Anybody else? Yes.
Surrealism.
Surrealism, anybody else? Yes.
Minimalism.
Minimalism, good. So whenever we put that ISM onto the end of a word, what does it do? How does it change the word? How does it change something from minimal to minimalism? What's the difference between minimal and minimalism?
It's a context. It's sort of how it's used.
Okay,
It's
capital or
context.
capitalism, how does that change things? How does it change things?
It gives it a broader purpose. So like for example, like you said, like minimalism, it's more of like a decor. It's instead of just this is a minimal.
Yeah, it becomes almost like a belief system. So we live in a capitalist society here, so the foundations of the way that we work in the United States are based upon buying and trading goods. So that's capitalism, whereas capital is just money. So, or the money that you need to start a business. So if we take that to a broader context and then we start to move it into the idea of an overarching idea of using money and trading money for services and goods. Minimal means that it's meant to be small, but if we take minimalism and we make it into an overarching thing, then the aesthetic is one where you're using very little, a little number of elements in the design that you're creating. Surreal, instead of something just being kind of weird. Now surrealism means that all of the parts and pieces are kind of mind-bending and odd. And so that's where we get the start of what we're going to talk about now, because all of the different artists' styles that we're going to talk about aren't really styles, they're causes. And for that, they have the letters ISM attached to them in just about every instance. Now, there's going to be a couple that have don't necessarily have to have the ISM attached to them, but there is a word that kind of goes sides along with it. Play along with me and you'll understand. So knowing that ISM is added onto a word and it changes something, or it makes it into a broader spectrum, what does that mean for the word cubism? What would cubism be?
A genre I would get. It'd be
It's a genre
good.
that means what?
Oh god.
What is a
I was
cube?
in classification.
What is a cube?
Well, it's
At first it was mainly to describe like art that was strictly cube. Like they would take like certain sections of a painting and make it all with cubes, and then developed more so into like a geometric, so it covered all like geometric cube looking
Right,
things.
exactly. So it's based upon the idea of geometric forms, the concept, the original concept of cubism. Anybody know who the founder of cubism was? Pablo Picasso. Pablo Picasso, and he teamed up with Georges Braque. They were buddies. And Pablo Picasso, this is not Cubism. This is actually a form of post-impressionism. So, when we get to about 1901, we're at this point where artists have been playing with post-impressionism. If you remember, impressionism was when they were doing swaths of paint really fast, and in post-impressionism, they started to elongate things and stretch things and morph things a little bit more, so that they weren't necessarily realistic anymore. This is really kind of a tie between Impressionism and Post-Impressionism, as the self-portrait that Picasso did. In any case, it's not really important the style that he painted it in. I just show it because we can see what his face was. He was very young in 1901. By 1905, 1906, he had developed a new style of painting, had moved from this Post-Impressionist style into something like this. And this is really considered the first Cubist painting. This is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which is the Ladies of Avignon, and they were meant to be a group of prostitutes bathing. So, what is weird about this picture? Somebody tell me. Okay, and what else?
The faces are a little weird.
Their faces are a lot weird in many places. What else do you see?
The faces are going like 4 different styles.
Yep, we've got lots of different styles going on with them. What else?
Looks like one of the faces kind of resembles a African mask.
Very good, yeah, in fact they do. Kind of like that. What else?
They're interacting with the viewer.
Yeah, they're all engaged with the viewer, so they're looking directly straight forward. What else do we notice about this painting? Do we know? I'm sorry, go ahead.
It's all women.
It's all women, yeah. So do we know where they're standing or sitting? No, they're kind of floating in space. What tells us that they're standing or sitting?
Their position.
Okay, sort of, yeah. But do we see anything that gives us like a direct idea of they're standing in profile, or they're sitting down in one direction? Yes.
The shape of their legs, or how their legs are positioned.
Yeah. What we notice here is the introduction of shapes into this composition, more so than anything that we've seen in Art Nouveau up until this point. Like, even if we looked at those Japanese ukiyo-es, and I pointed out to you that their hands were the wrong size, that their bodies were over-elongated, and if we looked at what Margaret and Frances McDonald were doing in those spook graphics or spook images of elongated figures, and we look at some of the things that the Vienna Secessionists were doing as far as turning those figures into kind of shapes. We've seen that idea of of skewing body parts, but we've never seen it quite like what we're seeing here, where we're looking at body parts and we can't quite tell if they're body parts or not. Like up there on the one in the upper right corner, we can assume that those are her breasts, but they're kind of squared, they're wedged off. And this is really what Picasso was starting to play with, was the idea of starting to interpret things from the natural world into hard geometric forms, which is very different from what we had in Art Nouveau, because if you remember, in Art Nouveau, everything was kind of dreamy and morphy and organic and really round and circular and symbolic. Now we're moving away from that. Symbolism has gone by the wayside, or starts to go to the wayside in this. Instead, the influences are things like African masks. And part of the reason for this is because of imperialism that was going on at the time. Africa had been a conquered continent, and there was a lot going on in that continent. The British were there, the Germans were there, the French were there, the Spaniards were there, all these different countries were there, and they were trying to cultivate or make the African tribes more sophisticated. And at the same time, the Europeans were bringing back artifacts from Africa, noticing how geometric those artifacts were. So the artists that were noticing what was going on in the African continent were certainly intrigued by what they were seeing as far as the native artwork that was happening there. But we also saw that a painter named Paul Cézanne had started to develop this idea of getting rid of the background and making things more based upon cylinders and spheres and cones. In fact, he said that we should be treating nature in that regard. And a lot of times when we do, if any of you guys have ever sketched, that's usually where we start. We start with a circle, or we start with a square, or we start with a triangle, and then we start to fill in the forms. But in the case of Paul Cézanne, he felt that rather than filling them in and making them more organic, we should hold on to those geometric forms. So Picasso glommed onto that. He liked that idea when he started to paint in this new style that he was creating. He was really thinking in terms of those geometric forms. There was another thing that he was doing, and if we go back to Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, you'll notice that the directions that their bodies, or the way that their bodies are turned, is really kind of odd. Like in this particular painting of the bather, we certainly see enough here that we can identify this as a female body nude. But what do we notice that's weird about the proportions of the way that the body is configured? Go ahead, Taylor.
I guess like it's like the perspective of it, like the person kind of like tilts it to the side that you wouldn't be able to see somebody's like butt like that.
Yeah.
It'd be like towards the back.
Yeah, so her face looks kind of flat, right? But look at her legs. We've got one leg here that's turned in profile, and the other leg is turned in a way that I cannot possibly turn my leg. What else? Yeah.
Every feature is sort of drawn in isolation.
Mhm.
Like nothing connects and everything's its own.
Right. So what Picasso was doing here was he was taking advantage of, again, technology as it already existed. He knew that the camera had come along, that there was no reason to paint things in realistic manners, in a realistic manner anyway. And we already knew this. The Impressionists, the Post-Impressionists, all of these guys already knew that there was no reason to paint things in a realistic way. But Picasso liked the idea of taking something that was three-dimensional and showing all of the different facets of that three-dimensional object, but working it on a two-dimensional plane. The canvas itself is a two-dimensional plane. There was no depth of field or depth or proportion or scope moving forward or back in a two-dimensional plane like a painting or a screen projection. Yet at the same time, you wanted to be able to make people understand that this object had more dimension to it than just this one angle that you would look at. So take, for example, this chair that's sitting in front of me and sitting in front of you. Each one of us has a different perspective of this chair. So what he was trying to do is he was trying to show this chair from all of those different perspectives. So the perspective that Peter would have of this chair, he would perhaps show the leg of the chair from that angle. And then the angle of the seat back that Anthony might be seeing, he would try to show that, but he would show it at the same time as what the leg was for Peter. And then the seat bottom, he might show it from the perspective that I have, which is more like that. And he might even go to the example of showing the chair in all kinds of different ways of moving the chair around and composing them all at the same time in the same depiction. He felt that it wasn't important that we see the chair exactly as it is because we don't need to. We know what a chair looks like. We can get pictures of chairs. But to understand the whole perspective of this chair or that bather or this particular person, we actually get a chance to see it from multiple perspectives, and that's what Cubism was about. They called this analytical Cubism when they were doing this because it meant that you are analyzing the thing that was being depicted. And again, they weren't really too concerned with being able to recognize the thing that was being done. What was important to the Cubists was that you, as the viewer, recognized that there was something there. And it was your job to try to figure out how those parts and pieces came together. So in some ways there was kind of a familiarity to the depiction. You can certainly recognize aspects of a human face in this. But it also becomes sort of like puzzle pieces. And your job is to try to recompose them and try to figure out what those pieces were. The Cubists of all folks were really pushing art to be an intellectual endeavor. And for that reason, they felt that what was happening with Art Nouveau was a betrayal to art in itself. They felt that by commercializing art and taking art and some very fine artists and having them sell work to sell a product was not what art was meant to be. And so if we look backwards at what happened with Art Nouveau, you'll notice that all of the artists in the Art Nouveau period signed their names to their work. Toulouse-Lautrec had a little mark that he created for his stuff, and every single one of his paintings or every one of his posters had that mark on it. The Beggar's Chest had a little mark that appeared on their work. We have the Vienna Secessionists or the Vienna Workshop. They had a mark that went on all of their collective works, and each individual artist had their own little mark that went onto this stuff. Aubrey Beardsley and the Glasgow Four and all of them signed their work. But after this, when Pablo Picasso and the Cubist artists started to denounce what Art Nouveau was doing and artistry for commercial purposes, these artists that had been doing commercial art stopped signing their stuff. And to this very day, most commercial artists do not sign their work. Every once in a while you'll have one that has a name that's recognizable and they want their work to stand out, so they'll sign their stuff. But for the most part, graphic artists or commercial artists consider themselves in a different world. And this is kind of a sad thing, but this is also part of what the Cubists were doing. They were trying to intellectualize art. And so by doing that, they were denouncing what happened in the commercial arts. For this reason, when we look at commercial art and how it applied stuff that was part of Cubism, you'll find very few examples of Cubism that is used as commercial art. But we use this because Cubism was the starting place for all of the different isms that we talk about. The idea here of being cerebral, of thinking outside of the box, of trying to look at art in a new perspective and modernizing art so it's less representational, less objectified and more subjective, meaning that it's open for interpretation. That would prevails in all of the different art isms that follow from here. There were lots of artists that were part of this movement: Juan Gris, Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, and so on. When analytical cubism certainly utilized this idea of shapes and it just varying perspectives. You'll notice that shadows go in different directions, and things seem dimensional, and sometimes they seem flat. So it's just a really interesting way that they compose it. I should just conclude that part about the artists and the what Pablo Picasso and those guys were doing. So to make sure that the point was clear for folks that were living in Paris at this time, which is where Pablo Picasso and Georges Braque and Juan Gris, all of these guys were painting as Cubist artists, they refused to live in Montmartre, where the Art Nouveau artists are living now. And this is Art Nouveau is still going on when Cubism starts to enter into the picture. Instead, they took up residence in another part of Paris called Montparnasse, and they made that the hub for art. So they kind of like created this myth or this ethos around art itself, so that if you were a real artist, then a real artist would live in Montparnasse. If you were just one of those commercial artists or somebody that was doing posters and stuff, you could live in Montmartre. They didn't want to associate with those lowly commercial artists. And to this very day, the high arts, the fine arts, like what Pablo Picasso was doing, looks down on commercial art. Better than it used to be, but we still have this point where they're considered two different worlds of art. That's really a matter of opinion, in my mind. Picasso also started to evolve this idea of analytical cubism into something called synthetic cubism. And synthetic cubism was when they would start to take real-life things and incorporate them into the work, to the point where they even became dimensional in some of the stuff that they did. And they weren't afraid to show textures and elements that were part of the real world and incorporate those into the paintings that they were doing. So a lot of times we might see things like musical notes or pieces of paper that are incorporated into the work, or things that look like wallpaper or even things that look like newspaper or print that are incorporated into the work, and that becomes this idea of synthetic cubism. Overall, though, here's the traits that we can see that are associated with cubism. So ultimately, what ends up happening is that we've got this figurative forms that are dissected, and then they're being looked at from all different angles. Everything's being minimalized into basic geometric forms: the cube, the sphere, the cone. There's also, in some cases, an underlying grid structure or structure underneath the things. The reason why these people were doing this, this idea of the cube, spheres, and cones was really to push away from that organic, soft, fluid notion that was happening with Art Nouveau. So these guys were really using the theme of machines in their work. And we know that Art Nouveau artists didn't have any problem with machines either, but their stuff had a tendency to look very, very organic in nature. Now, the artists that are part of this Cubist movement are pushing more towards engineering and science as an underlying structure to the things that they were doing. We'll also notice that although the works become very abstract, it's not that they lack emotion to them. There's still emotion that's tied to them, but they're definitely moving away from organic, fluid forms. I recommend that if you're lost in here or you can't write fast enough, that you just do a screen cap or take a picture of this slide, and I can come back at the end of class so that you can take a look at this even more. I'm going to move on from here, so again, I can come back at the end of the class so you can capture this even more. The next ism that we're going to talk about is a branch off of the world of Cubism, and that is futurism. So again, knowing that adding the word ISM onto a word, like the word future, changes it. What do you think futurism is about?
The future.
Yeah. About the future. What else? What about the future? Do you think it's positive, negative? Jessica?
Futurism is based, I'm not saying 100% certain, I'm just guessing, but whenever I think of this, I'm thinking of like the flying car, or the image of a woman speaking on a phone, and there's like a thing in front of her showing someone else.
Okay.
And they're like drawing what the future might look like, or what the future art might look like.
Okay, you're close there. And what are you
I
going
was
to say?
thinking technological innovation,
Mhm.
advanced technologies.
Exactly. So it's about technology and then technological advances and embracing those. And really not even just the idea of things going forward into the future, but actually getting rid of all the things from the past. Like literally getting rid of the past and thinking only about moving into the future. So futurism was invented by an Italian poet. His name is Filippo Marinetti. I'll show you his name in a few minutes. But the goal of this movement was really one to celebrate these new machines that were coming out at the turn of the century. So if you think about what was happening here, we started to see automobiles. We started to see things like electric ovens, and telephones were widely used, and now we had radios that started to come into the scene. So people were actually starting to hear the sound of radio being projected through a box that sat in their homes or from someplace else. That there were X-rays, so you can look through a body and see the bones that were inside, or trams that were working in cities that would transport you from one place to another, so you didn't have to climb into a buggy or harness up a horse. Now a vehicle would take you from one end of the city to another, or people started to build taller buildings. So, that used to be like 4 stories was the max, and then it became 20 stories, and then it became 100 stories within the span of 20 years. So all of these things, these new innovations were happening. People were really excited about it, and machinery and technology were at the heart of this. So the folks that were part of this futurist movement were very excited about technology, and they were embracing it. Here's an example of futurism. The guy who did this, Umberto Boccioni, is just one of many Italians that were playing with the futurist work. What do we notice about this painting, this piece? Jessica?
It's very bright.
Okay. Anything else?
I I don't know why, but I see a horse in a like an old ship.
Horse, what else?
There's both, like geometric and organic elements to it.
Very good. Anything else?
Feels wavy.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't know like if that's like something.
No, it is, in fact. Go ahead, Taylor. What do you think?
I don't think you could really, like, no one could really depict what he was actually trying to, like, portray anything to him. Like,
Okay.
You don't have a really good idea of exactly what it is, it's just kind of like,
Do you recognize anything in this? Does it look like something to you?
um,
Looks like an explosion there. What's it look like to you?
You got some high T wires in the back.
Okay.
I see us.
Anybody else? What does it look like, Jessica?
I see a horse with a cowboy on its back in a saddle with a sail ship in
Oh, I
the
see it
upper
now,
right
okay.
corner.
oh yeah, I see.
Currently on a trail.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Yep.
what I see.
Yep. And if we look here, what do we see?
Soldiers.
Soldiers. What are they doing?
Marching.
Marching. So there's a lot of aspects to futurism that confuse people because it looks a lot like cubism in many regards. The way that the objects are turned into shapes and into forms, and how they don't necessarily show things from one perspective. However, and very geometric in the way that they're doing. However, the big difference between futurism and cubism is that futurism shows an object in motion. That's the big thing. That, again, if we look back here, you can see the horse in motion, and look at, once you're able to identify that there's a horse and a person riding on it, and there's ships in the background and all kinds of stuff going on here, you start to recognize, oh, okay, it's a horse that's running, and that's why it looks wavy, as Jessica said. Or here we have soldiers that are all marching. We can see that. Sometimes the stuff that they did was not necessarily a thing itself, but there certainly was the idea, the sensation of motion that was going on in the stuff that they were doing.
That's so cute.
So ultimately, what they're conveying is a static object, but they're showing it in motion, and that's how they're projecting the idea of future, of things that are progressing. In their depictions, in futurist depictions. They called this, when you were able to see things from the same thing from multiple perspectives of movement, they call it simultaneity. Simultaneity, meaning simultaneously. So simultaneity was the aspect that they incorporated into the work that they believed. And for Marinetti, Filippo Marinetti, he believed that the goal here was really to use that idea of inertia, of movement, or conquering inertia, non-movement, to forge this new art. And he actually wrote a manifesto talking about how the traditional things that existed needed to go away, and created this manifesto for what futurism was about. And he said, we will glorify war. The world's only hygiene, holy smokes. Militarism, patriotism, and destructive gesture of freedom bringers, beautiful ideas worth dying for, and we will scorn women. So that's kind of scary, all of those things that he was saying. But ultimately, interpreting what he was trying to say was that war, when we have war, it destroys old. We destroy the old buildings, and that means that we have the opportunity to build new buildings. And instead of building these new buildings so that they look like the old buildings, their idea was to build new buildings so that they were embracing this technology. As far as scorning women, what he was really talking about was not female so much, because there were female futurists among them, but it was the idea of this kind of womanly design that they felt that Art Nouveau was about. So all of that fluidity and softness and roundness and spaghetti-like hair and all of that stuff, these guys hated it. They wanted to get rid of it, and they wanted to embrace the idea of new technology, of movement, of moving forward, and just showing things so that you could see the progression that was going on. There were some that were attempting to be architects, and so they drew city plans, and you can see when we look at this that this is very, very modern in the way that it's interpreted. Certainly doesn't look like any kind of old, structure left over from, several hundred years back. This has been considered very modern and new. And the nice part about the futurists was that they didn't feel like they were limited to any particular kind of form of art. So here's Umberto Boccioni, the guy who did that original painting, and he's interpreting futurism into sculpture. Or here's a wall image, a wall graphic that is also in the futurist vein. And there were a number of artists that played with this, like you might recognize this painting by Marcel Duchamp, and he's painting in this futurist vein. It's called Nude Descending a Staircase, and it's, again, a lot of people consider this to be a cubist painting, but really when we analyze it, we can see that it's actually a figure that's in motion. As I said, they weren't limited to the way that they presented the idea of futurism. They could do it in painting, they could do it in sculpture. They also embraced the idea of graphic arts, which is where we tie in to what we're studying. So Filippo Marinetti, here's his name, he's the founder again. He believed that if you were going to use graphic arts, that you should use the latest form of graphic arts, which meant that there were photo montage and photographic images taken of real, already completed graphic arts. And so he would often create what he called pattern poetry, where he would take paintings, or graphic depictions, and skew those proportions of the images through camera manipulation or redrawing the letter forms so that they were super elongated, and changing them around. His viewpoint was that if you, as a viewer, had witnessed a car crash, that you would be speaking impromptu. You would be speaking in the moment, reporting what it was that you saw. And so, if you saw a car crash and somebody asked you what happened, you would go, "There was there was a crash and somebody got hurt," and you would stumble over how you were relaying that. That's what he was trying to convey through this futurist works. And over again, when they were creating futurist imagery like this, they felt like the immediacy, the reactionary aspect of what they were trying to convey was really a part of the word. So they allowed for things to be explosive, for things to be kind of randomized. They didn't care about syntax or legibility or any of those things that kind of go along with regular graphic arts. They allowed themselves to think in terms of turning things, of making the page shift around. The things on the page were shifting around, and you as the viewer might be shifting the page around so that you can read and understand what was going on the page. So they really pushed the idea of typesetting to new grounds, and there were a number of folks that played with this in the form of poetry, just even taking the idea of an image and reinterpreting it through typography. Today we do this all the time in typography, but in 1910 or so, when this was really being innovated, it was new. Nobody was really thinking about doing stuff like this up until the futurists. Lewis Carroll maybe, when he did the Alice in Wonderland story, but this is just only one particular page in that book. He didn't do it throughout, whereas the futurists tried to apply this throughout all of this stuff. So they took advantage of the idea of the graphic arts. They published stuff in newspapers, including their manifesto, and they created this kind of graphic that they were using at the top. And when they started to play with this idea of graphic interpretations of futurism, they weren't afraid of, again, showing that idea of simultaneity, of showing things from multiple perspectives, or showing things that had transparency in them, so that the idea was conveyed of movement and motion. The one person that we want to talk about here as a futurist, his name is Fortunato de Pero. Fortunato de Pero is really the most important person among the futurists that we want to talk about. And he was considered very gung-ho about the futurist cause. He met with the group in 1915, around the time when the futurist movement was at its height. But Fortunato de Pero did not stop in 1915. The futurist movement started to fade away after that, but Fortunato de Pero continued to do this stuff for a long period of time. He was a writer, he did stuff for newspapers, he founded a magazine that was called Dynamo. He held personal exhibitions. He did theater work. He created stage sets and costumes using futurism as a motif in the stuff that he was doing. So there was some really exceptional stuff among the things that he did. This particular piece was from an exhibit that happened as part of the World's Fair at that time. So that great exhibition of 1851 that Prince Charles had conceived way back when, it continued on, and so every 5 to 10 years there was another World's Fair, and so in 1925 they were having another World's Fair, and the futurists were going to exhibit there, and so Fortunato de Pero created this book that he wanted to show, and it was an 80-page catalog of advertising designs, and the book itself had a very stiff cover. You'll notice that it's held together with a couple of screws, and the 3 of these were actually made out of tin, the book covers themselves. On the interiors, again, this looks much like some of the designs that we play with in our our basic typography courses, or changing direction and playing with the ideas, the notions of perspective. And readability and legibility. In this particular case, de Pero felt he didn't need to constrain himself to the normal idea. If you read from top to the bottom, you read from the left to the right. He wanted people to actually hold this book and turn it around so that you could read stuff. And every single page that he does, he's playing with the idea of shape or the idea of motion within the work that he did. Again, forcing the viewer to interact with the book so that there is motion and action just in reading. And then for de Pero, he himself would play with this idea of forming things into shapes, creating pictures out of the typography, and using this. We're going to see other people that play with this as we move along. But sadly for us, this guy, Fortunato de Pero, Filippo Marinetti, not Fortunato, Filippo Marinetti, the founder of this movement, he really gave futurists a difficult road to hoe. A lot of people did not like futurism because of him, because of his antics. For example, one of the things that he liked to do was disrupt civic engagements where people were doing things in a traditional way, like if you had a concert in the park, right? Nice little thing to do on a Sunday afternoon, go to the park, have a picnic lunch, listen to some orchestral music, all of that very nice. But Filippo Marinetti would get together a band of futurists, and they would come to the park at the same time that the concert was going on, and they would bang on drums, and they would beat cymbals, and they would be disruptive for the concert itself, just because they could. And he wrote statements, the manifestos that a lot of people didn't like very much, and he was really all about the idea of tearing down old traditional ways. A lot of people just really didn't like this. Because he was having a hard time finding people to embrace what he was doing, he actually glommed onto some fascist dictators, and believed in some of the ideology that they had. And so as a result, a lot of people came to associate futurism with fascism, which it wasn't really, but because of Marinetti and his antics, that's how it sort of went. So futurism fell out of favor around 1925 or so. In the 1930s, it was completely gone from the face of the world, at least as far as most people are considered. However, it still lives on as far as a design technique, and we're going to see more of it, especially when we get into Art Deco. So futurism really ran anywhere from like 1910 or so to about 1930, and the people that we talk about associated with it are Fortunato de Pero. You can nix Edward McKnight Coffer. We're going to associate him more with Art Deco. But what we see with futurism is an advocation of machines, of cities, of new technologies, of anything that's advancing mankind into more machine-like thinking. The themes were that of motion, of progress, of energy, and then there was this kind of destruction of old society and methods, and simultaneity, positives and negatives happening at the same time, and of course we have political fascism that's tied to it. I just want to point out that the Cubists didn't have political notions, they didn't have a political leaning, but the Futurists did, and it, as a result of Marinetti. And so as a result of it, we start to see the isms all have kind of political calculus to them too. Yes?
Did he consider himself a fascist?
Yeah, he felt that the annihilation that those fascist dictators were talking about fit right into his goals, into his manifesto. Get rid of the old, all new. Let's build a new society. Yeah, it's kind of scary. Any other questions? Okay, so let's look at the next movement called Dada. And you'll notice that the ism isn't at the end of it. You can say Dadaism though, I'm fine with that, but just saying the word Dada, I left it like this on purpose, because what does Dada mean?
Dad?
Anybody know what Dada means?
I don't know what the word itself means, but like I know what that period of time comes from.
Okay.
It's post-war,
Mm-hmm.
so I don't know how long time.
Pre-war, actually.
I'm sorry, pre-war.
Is it like gun action?
What's that?
Dada.
Okay. Did you know, Liz?
No.
No, okay. The fact is that even the Dadaists didn't know what Dada meant.
Wow.
This is a really kind of kooky branch of art. But the fun part about it is it still lives today. And
Is it
it's
like made of dots?
Nope. If you try to find something representational in this name, you're going to lose out, because Dada, they made the word up. They made it up. So, or at least that's how some people feel about it. Some say that the Dadaists, they just chose the word by opening up a German dictionary and like leaping through and sticking a finger on it, coming up with the word Dada, which means hobby horse. Or some people say Dada is like one of the first words that a baby will utter, so that's what it's referencing. They didn't know. And so when we look at Dadaism, to me, my interpretation of Dadaism is it's futurism with a sense of humor. So the idea that the futurists wanted to destroy the world, that they wanted to cut down, take away all tradition, all things of the past, well, that's kind of true with futurists, or with Dadaists too. They didn't like the idea of the world being the way it had been either. They wanted to push away from the norms of society. In all cases, these guys are rebelling. Every single one of them is rebelling in their own way, and the Dadaists were rebelling as well. They were rebelling against tradition. However, where the futurists felt that destroying meant that you would blatantly blow a building up, or that you would crash cymbals through a concert to destroy the sound that people were hearing. The Dadaists just felt like, well, let's recognize that there's these differing point of view, and let's just have fun. Let's make fun of it. Let's just make fun of it. That's what they did. So one of the things that the Dadaists did that's very intrinsic in the stuff that they did was they never actually created their own art. Which is kind of interesting and fun too. If they did anything, they might write some words on something, but they would always steal from other pieces, from other parts. This is a printed piece that's been taped onto, and then there's a piece of string that's connected, and then the words that are occurring here. They never actually created new things. They just reinvented old things. So Marcel Duchamp, who we just saw the nude descending the stair, he was famous as a Dadaist, and he, in this particular case, he just took bits of things that he found from construction, embedded them into a couple of pieces of glass, and created this composition. And then somewhere along the line, the glass got cracked, and he thought, oh, that's even better. So what does it mean? Who knows? And this is the whole thing about Dada. They didn't know what the pieces meant. They would dress up into these funky costumes, and they would go out and they would recite poetry that made absolutely no sense at all. Usually it was just a repeated sound, like da, 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 da. You say it enough times with different emphasis, da, 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 da. it becomes a form of art. And that's what these guys would do. They would just create this kind of nonsensical stuff. And the reason that they were doing this was to really kind of poke fun at art, period, art, and the world of art, and how people were so, like, especially the Cubists, who were so high and mighty and full of themselves, that they felt like, okay, Cubists, you guys deserve to be made fun of too. You think that you're so super sophisticated and all of that. Well, we're going to make fun of you, and we're just going to act like we're so sophisticated and dressing up in these crazy outfits and go out there and pretend that this is art. And the question started to become, where is the line between nonsense and art? And that's really the heart of what the Dadaists did, and that's part of the reason why they never actually did work themselves. They always stole from someplace else. So if they did they, like the Futurists, they grabbed onto the idea of graphic arts. They would take things and reproduce them in a graphic way. But they never actually set the type themselves. It became kind of like ransom letter kind of motifs that they did. Here's a picture that they did for one of the exhibitions that they put on the first International Dada Fair. And you might notice that, hanging from the ceiling here is a mannequin that's got a pig's face on it wearing a German uniform. German military uniform, and the pictures on the wall are just like these montages, these collages of pictures of people and then words that are kind of displayed all over the place on the walls, and they mean nothing. In fact, if you paid the admission to go to the show, after the show is over, you were allowed to take anything off the walls with you. That's how little regard they had for this art. But at the same time, people would gather for this art, pay money to go into this show. That's part of the joke, as far as they were concerned. And so they used this idea of montage often in the stuff that they did, and they used it to actually make points. So, like, among the early Dadaists is Marcel Duchamp, and this is, some of his stuff is fabulous. It's incredible. This thing that he used with these found objects, we have a chair and we have a wheel that are attached to each other. He called these ready-mades, these sculptures, he called them ready-mades because they were already made from something else, and he just put them together again. And you can read a lot into this particular piece. We've got something that's static, a stool, and then it's countered with a wheel that is in motion. We have one half of it that's white and the other half that's black. And we can even go so far as to say, I can start to see a face and a body, and there's nose, and you can start to analyze this to death and start to see all kinds of stuff. But at the heart of it, it's just a chair and a wheel. And it's like this is where they were kind of like poking fun. How much is this is art, and how much of it isn't? Here's another one. So at this time, Marcel Duchamp found a postcard of the Mona Lisa, and he drew a mustache and a goatee on Mona.
Is that when that trend started? Just drawing mustaches on.
Yeah, he started the trend.
I can't say if that was, no, I'm sure there was graffiti before
No,
that time.
they
There's a lot
have
of
to
graffiti.
started the trend. It's
But
Dada.
the part that is missing here, and you'll notice he signed his name, Marcel Duchamp, on this. The part that's missing is the lower part of this that's actually very important to this particular piece. And that's the letter forms LHOOQ. And you guys will never understand what those words mean, even if you speak another language. But it was meant, Marcel Duchamp was French, and they meant something to him. And I'll explain what they mean. So, anybody here speak French at all?
On that power fonts I've seen.
How do those letters sound when you put them at each individual letter? LHOOQ. It's LHOOQ. LHOOQ are the letters LHOOQ. In French, if you start to say those letters over and over again, let them kind of slide together, they turn into LHOOQ, 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 which, do you know what that means? It means she's got a hot ass. She's got a hot ass. LHOOQ means she's got a hot ass. Mona. She's got a hot ass. Does she? I mean, no, but
He really put that on his artwork?
that's what he put on his artwork. And that's,
Like, how long did it take for people to figure this out? like,
Well, and that's the point. It's like, should they? Should they spend the time to try to figure it out because it's meaningless? It really doesn't mean anything. But they would sit there and puzzle it out. This is what Dada was about. It was about poking fun and making people try to think, and then maybe it's not really important that they think. Like this particular piece that went on display. It's called The Fountain, and guys, what is this thing? The urinal. So, ladies, we don't necessarily see this on a day-to-day basis, but guys certainly know what this is. And what he did, what Marcel Duchamp did, was he was actually a juror in an exhibition, and he was kind of pissed because they, literally, because they weren't showing more modern pieces in there. So, overnight, when nobody was looking, he took a urinal. He signed Armut along the side of it and put it on a pedestal in the middle of the room. And it's a part of this exhibition. And people would wander past all the pieces on the wall and look at that and go, And it took him a day to discover that they had a urinal in the middle of this art exhibition. That's smart.
So was all this like satirical, or was it just like making fun of just for the sake of making fun?
Both.
Oh,
Both. I mean, it was a real art movement. There were real artists of it, and I'm going to show you actually this guy, John Hartfield, who was really very dramatic in the way that he was used Dadaism in the work that he did. But really, what it came down to is passing along a message and using this art as a means to create some kind of a message. So whether it's overt or whether it was meant to be funny or whatever, it's kind of up to you as the reader. Or you can just choose not to read anything into it at all. And that was, again, part of the interpretation of the Dadas. So the guy here, his name was, it says here his name was John Hartfield, but his real name was Helmut Herzfeld. He too was a Dadaist. He was very, very into Dadaism. But he was also really, really pissed at the government. Yes?
Was he a Nazi?
He was not a Nazi. He was opposed to the Nazis. And so that's what his whole theme became in all the works that he started to do. He would use photo montage as his method. And so he would found images of things like trees and cut them apart, airbrush them, reinterpret them, and then put them together again, rephotograph them to create new pieces of art. And that's what this is. So he did this over and over and over again. And the reason why he changed his name was because he was so opposed to what the Nazis were doing, and especially about how the Nazis, as they started to rise, which was after World War I, I'll go into a little bit about the history here, but after World War I, and the Nazis started to rise, and they started to scapegoat other countries, British and Americans were among the people that the Nazis were criticizing. And so because he saw that they didn't really care who they were criticizing, as long as if they had a German name, they wouldn't bother with it, but if they had another name, then the Nazis would go after them. John Hartfield purposely changed his name to John Hartfield instead of Helmut Herzfeld. And he found, again, image after image after image that he put into work. And you'll notice the year here, 1935, we got 1932, we got some 1920s, here we got 1928. But what we see over and over again in the works that he was doing was this is long past the time of most normal Dadaists. For the Dadaists, the reason why they came about in the around 1912, 1914, 1916, was that they were actually protesting the idea of war and the atrocities of war. And so World War I was a devastating war. It was a horrible war. But once the war was over, they didn't really have anything to protest anymore. And so a lot of the Dadaists kind of disbanded or went off and did their own thing. They weren't necessarily putting together any Dadaist poetry readings anymore. But there were some folks that kept on with this idea, and Helmut Herzfeld or John Hartfield would continue to in vein of Dadaism and continue to go along with it. his work was so, well, for one thing, he was a communist in his belief system, so he certainly didn't stand for what Nazism was about. Nazis hated communism. So there was that, but he also just saw the atrocities that were being committed by the Nazis even before anybody else was really seeing them. He tried to point them out to people. He would publish his images in communist propaganda newspapers and magazines. And for a long time he got away with this, but by the time we get to the mid to late 1930s, that's when Hitler's at his full power, and he started to go after John Hartfeld, and John Hartfeld ended up fleeing, went to Great Britain, and lived the rest of his life in Great Britain because he was about to be hauled off to a concentration camp along with a lot of other folks in Germany at that time. But he had his period where he was actually in Germany and saying nasty things about Adolf Hitler. There are other Dadaists that we can point to, like Man Ray. Man Ray was a photographer, and he liked to play with images. And in his particular case, he did photograph his own images, so he was not necessarily like the other Dadaists who always found images, including John Hartfield. In this case, Man Ray created his own images, but what he does is he really kind of does that irony, that twisting of his images, so that here, this image shows a woman's tears, except that they're not tears, they're actually just glass beads that are placed on her face. He was also a commercial artist, and so we see commercial arts that are being utilizing the idea of Dadaism in here. So this is a series of posters for the London Underground that is capitalizing off of Dada as well. Yes?
Did he place the items afterwards or prior to the photo? Like
Prior, he staged them.
for the cello one too?
Yeah, well, the cello one, he did that after the
Oh,
fact.
wow.
Yeah, so he did those cutouts after the fact.
Oh, okay.
But the
Okay.
glass beads were definitely placed on her face, and then he photographed them. And here, he staged this as well, and he shot this photograph. Here's a really great representation of what Dadaism, and I love this one because it takes place in 1958, and Man Ray is writing, and he says, "Why? Who cares? Who doesn't care? Dada is dead, or is Dada still alive? We cannot revive something that is alive, just as we cannot revive anything that is dead. Is Dada dead? Is Dada alive? Dada is Dadaism. Dada." And so here is like the breakdown on what we can see for Dadaism, the period of time that it was about. It's really about a protest of war, but we did it with mockery, with irony, at least in its initial stages. Now we have Neo-Dadaism that we're going to look at as we'll at least consider it as part of the things that we move forward. They embrace the futurist ideals, that of advancement of new technology and breaking away from tradition. They felt that chaos was equal to change, that nonsensical stuff would get people's attention, they pay attention to it. And they ultimately used collage and found objects for most of the things that they did. I think I've got room for one more here. So one more ism.
What,
That-
can you,
Yeah.
let me just take a picture of this. Thank you.
So the next ism is called surrealism, and I think I already mentioned the idea of something being surreal means that it's kind of weird and odd, and surrealism is all the things that are done are real or odd. In fact, the word surreal comes from the French, and it means super real, super real. And for a lot of the artists that were playing with surrealism, they were playing with a reality that they felt was beyond the scope of reality and into a super real world, or the world of dreams. And so they were basing their stuff on the idea of dream interpretations in many regards. Man Ray, I just pointed his stuff and his work as a photographer. He developed a technique in photography called posterization or solarization that he utilized here. And in posterization or solarization, it comes down to the exposure of that negative. That negative is reversed halfway through the process. And so you get this kind of positive effect and negative effect that happens at the same time. And what ends up happening is you get this kind of melting transition between shadows and highlights. And creates a really interesting kind of composition. So Man Ray was certainly one of those folks that was playing with the idea of surrealism in his photography, as well as Dadaism. A lot of these guys did a lot of different worlds. We also had others that were playing with the idea of the super reality. And the thing that you probably notice in surrealism is that these images take on a very realistic interpretation. Unlike Cubism, where you can't really tell what the heck is going on, in surrealism, you can identify the parts and pieces, almost to the point where they're so precise that they feel odd because everything is in sharp detail, and there's absolutely no blurring of edges. But at the same time, you get this kind of skewing perspective, like, okay, is it a picture of trees? Is it a picture of a woman on a horse? Is a horse in the trees? But how come the trees are cutting over the body of the horse, and so on? Probably the biggest name in surrealism belongs to a guy named Salvador Dali. And again, these guys were feeding off of the prior isms before them, so not necessarily of Dadaism, but certainly of futurism. And they incorporated something, that notion of simultaneity that we saw in futurism, except that was done here in surrealism. For the surrealists, simultaneity meant the same thing happening again and again and again in various parts of the picture. So if we examine this particular picture, we can actually see that the image that we might recognize here in the foreground is happening again at the top of the painting. And then the other part of it was that these the figures here can be interpreted in a couple of different ways. It's almost a Gestalt figure-ground type of relationship, where we can see the face of a man. Here's his nose, here's his eyes, here's his lips, here's his chin, there's his hair, here's his shoulder, and we recognize that figure. But at the same time, if we look at it from another perspective, we see that this is the back of a man. Here's his arm wrapped around a woman. Here's his buttocks. Here's her buttocks and her legs walking away. Here's a man hanging off of a cliff being dangled down. Here's a whole group of people that are fighting. Here's another man holding his hand out and pushing away from the man that's embracing the woman, and so on. So there's a lot of different things all happening simultaneously within this particular composition. Now you would look at this and you would think, oh, this is a really kind of gruesome scene. And you look at other things that Salvador Dali did and you'd say, oh, this is a really gruesome scene. But the fact is that surrealists actually had a very optimistic view of the world. They felt that by unleashing this inner dialogue or turmoil within man, that we were unleashing it from our soul, and so that we can become better human beings as a result of this. Again, these guys had political beliefs. They were considered communists, or they enjoyed the idea of communism. And so they really felt that the idea of this stream of consciousness kind of work was really important. In fact, most of them created paintings and they didn't know what they were going to become, but they painted them in this hyper-realistic way. And there was also, again, some kind of almost a sense of humor in the pieces that they were doing, and a super realistic interpretation, and something that was just kind of odd about all the pieces. It didn't seem like they were in the real world. Things were bent or skewed, or shadows were going at odd angles, or there was absolutely nothing that lightened up things in the background. It was this hyper hard edged, where the angles were going in different directions. So surrealism was, again, embraced by a lot of different artists. It really doesn't play so much into the isms the art movements at that time, but in present day we see a lot of surrealism being used as a launching point for graphic interpretations, and you can see that a lot. So here's the traits of surrealism. This is a little later than what we saw with, it picks up after Dadaism falls off. Ultimately, they believe that dream becomes a reality, a la Sigmund Freud, and dream interpretation. There was optimistic belief in the human spirit. They sought renewal, nonviolence. And then they used a lot of symbols in the work that they did. So but they did so through this realistic, super real world. And then there's roots here of Dadaism as well as roots of Futurism and the things that they were doing. And we're going to end there.